This is the Ivy League Hoops Hour, where we cover all things men's basketball in the Ancient Eight. We are your hub, your go-to, your day one, but not really though. I'm your co-host, Coach Sidney Johnson, former head coach of the Princeton Tigers from 2007 to 2011, and former three-time captain of the Tigers in 95, 96, and 97. My co-host is Princeton alum and former Princeton graduate assistant coach, my guy, Lawrence L. Boogie Schuler. Lawrence, how you making out?
Coach, brothers and sisters, I announce to you a great joy. We have a champion. Habemus Papam.
Well, Lawrence, that'll work for me if it works for you. And I hope it works for our listeners as we dive into another episode of our podcast. And boy, are we enjoying this ride as we close out last week, the last round of regular season games, and are rolling right into Ivy Madness, only a few days away. We can't do this without you. You know the drill. Please email us your questions, your comments, your reactions to Ivy League play and topics that we bring up on the show. ivyleaguehoopshour@gmail.com. That's how to connect with us. A reminder that we are tweeting things out in terms of teasing what we have coming up. You can check us out on Instagram as well. Lawrence and I are always pushing out notices on the show, Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel, the Ivy League Hoops Hour. John Solomon joins us as our chief in-game correspondent week in and week out, and we have a special roundtable discussion, highlight of the season for us, for myself and Lawrence, as we talk to four representatives of the Ivy League teams who have qualified for Ivy Madness on the men's basketball side of things. That would be Derek Jones from Princeton has done play-by-play for the Princeton Tigers for many a year. We have Vince Curran, who does color analysis for the Penn Quakers, is also a former student athlete for Penn and coached on the men's basketball team. No one loves Penn more than Vince. Will McCormack, who's joined us from the Yale Daily News earlier in our season and has returned for our roundtable discussion. And the one and only, a true institution, folks, in Ivy League basketball, Barry Leonard, for the Cornell Big Red, has done play-by-play for them for years, men's and women's basketball, obviously done work for ESPN, and he is outstanding with a wealth of knowledge. The four of these gentlemen, along with Lawrence, myself, and John, a full and rich discussion, a joyful one, as we kind of cross enemy lines, if you will, put the rivalries aside and promote the love and passion we have for Ivy League basketball. So we're going to get into My Eyes Don't Lie to Me and then roll right into our roundtable discussion. Welcome, folks, to this week's edition of My Eyes Don't Lie to Me as we recount the week that was in Ivy League men's basketball. Forgive us in advance for our brevity, as we are all extremely excited for Ivy Madness, which is only days away at the time of this recording. We have a special roundtable discussion planned for you to highlight the four teams competing in the men's bracket for Ivy Madness and all other things men's basketball in the Ancient Eight, but not before we cover the last round of games that have led us up to this point in the season. Let's start at the Palestra as our chief in-game correspondent, John Solomon, covered the battle between the Tigers and the Quakers.
All right, brevity. I'll do my best. It was a 93-70 Princeton win to close conference play. After the game was over and the regular season trophy had been awarded to his squad, Tosan Iwoman walked across the Palestra floor with an Ivy League championship banner around his shoulders like a green cape, which was fitting because on Saturday night he was Superman. 23 points on 9 for 14 shooting, 7 assists, 8 rebounds. But I want to start by talking about a moment that isn't part of this stat line, one he'd probably like to forget. It was 10-9 Tigers following a Drew Freiberg 3 in transition that provided Princeton their first lead. The senior brought the ball up the floor and no Penn player picked him up, so he simply stopped behind the arc and connected. At the other end, Michael Moshkovitz crossed over Tosan, and the junior slipped on defense, unable to do anything but watch helplessly from the floor as Mosh floated to the rim. Now, Tosan is an excellent player. He's my Ivy Player of the Year at this point. I called him a unicorn the first time we talked. Totally unique Tiger. There's no comparison I can make from my years of watching Princeton play. Nimble, yes, long for sure, but I wouldn't call him fiery. However, this defensive embarrassment in front of a visiting crowd, guys, I swear it made him mad, and he took his determination to another level. Good for Princeton, bad for Penn. Ethan Wright picked up his second personal foul with 12:08 left, and the score became tied at 17 on a pair of Jordan Dingle free throws. The senior Wright had been doing a good job of keeping the high-scoring Dingle in check, but with Wright off the floor, I thought Princeton drew up something very clever involving Tosan. They didn't have him guard Dingle one-on-one, but used him instead as the second defender who came up with a hand raised each time Dingle went around a screen at the arc. There was no path to the basket. Dingle settled for contested jumpers. Yes, he finished with 31 again, but he was 0 for 8 from 3, and 19 of those points came in a second half where his team never closed within 8. Penn led 21-19 on a Lucas Monroe tip follow before the Tigers took control. With the game's next 11 points, Tosan capped the run by rebounding a Clark Slidert miss, keeping his head up the entire time and driving coast to coast for a layup. Jalen Llewellyn actually led Princeton with 24, surpassing 1,000 career points in the process on a nasty drop-step split of a double team. I either texted you two or Stephen Goldsmith at halftime after Llewellyn made it 45-31 to say, Princeton's basically playing 6 guys. Ryan Langborg was out as a precaution, and they might win by 20 plus. And in the second half, that's exactly what transpired. I spent the final 10 minutes of regulation with Princeton up by 14 or greater the entire time, hopeful that Drew Freiberg would get a final basket, so I could research when the last time was that 3 Tigers reached 20 points or more in the same game. Alas, it didn't occur, as Freiberg totaled 18. Penn coach Steve Donahue was not on the sidelines of the Palestra due to COVID protocols. Senior Jelani Williams started for the Quakers, but the home team intentionally committed a violation on the opening jump ball so he could immediately come off the floor for the night. It was a season high in points versus a Division I foe for Princeton, and Saturday equaled the most points ever scored by the Tigers versus the Quakers. That other occurrence came in 1962. Biggest margin of victory for Princeton against Penn since a 63-39 game in 1976. Coach, since you took your team to the Palestra in March 2009 and ended a 5-game winning streak for your rivals, Princeton has won 22 of 26 matchups. Credit to the Penn Athletic Department for always calling it like it is and describing this season finale as humbling, because it was.
Brilliant work there, John. I love the strategy of Henderson and his staff. Dingle can put up points, but he'll break you back. I mean, he'll bring it all the way home if you let him get threes. And I'm glad to see that challenge. Not rooting against Dingle at all, but I'm glad to see that challenge of force him to beat you with twos, and any good shooter like that. And he is dynamite from 3. Well done, Tigers. Quakers will live to fight another day. And the dominance of Henderson and his staff and the program over Penn is pretty remarkable. Next game on the docket, Dartmouth visiting Harvard for their senior night.
This was the upset of the week. Dartmouth defied the odds and won convincingly on the road at Harvard, 76-54. It was a tough shooting day for Harvard. Coach, you've said it before. They've been a jump shooting team in league play, and on Saturday, they missed a lot of shots, as it were, from the jump. After 10 minutes, they had only 7 points and went into halftime down 31-21. Brendan Barry broke the Dartmouth record for career three-point makes in this game. He shot 5 of 10 from the field, 4 of 8 from 3. He led the team with 19 points in the day, matching Harvard's leading scorer, Noah Kirkwood, who played 36 minutes, the most of any Harvard player, even though he was hobbled by the injury that cut his minutes last week. As a team, Dartmouth shot 22 of 25 from the free throw line. They also got double-digit scoring from Aaron Rye, Taurus Samuels, and Dame Adelican, which is fitting for a group that's played solid, efficient basketball throughout the season.
Credit to Dartmouth for finishing their season as strong as they did after their demoralizing loss at Jadwin. They wrap up Ivy play winners of 4 out of 5, and their lone loss was a 5-point defeat to Yale.
Well, I want to echo that, John, from the standpoint of I actually agree. I don't think it can be called attention to enough to win 4 of your last 5. They were in striking distance from maybe getting the 4 seed, but it was a stretch. And to keep the guys inspired and playing hard and their best basketball at a very, very tough, challenging time of the year where you probably aren't going to make the postseason tournament. Well done to McLaughlin. Well done to the kids, the leadership on and off the floor. And, call it what it was. Crimson had an injury-riddled season and essentially, pardon the pun, but they limped to the finish line. Big Green capitalized. Well done, Dartmouth. Let's swing it over to Cornell, taking on Columbia. Pretty much had locked up the 4 seed, but momentum is a thing, folks, wanting to play your best basketball. And that easily could have been a trap game. Lawrence, what'd you see from the Cornell-Columbia matchup?
After a sluggish start, Cornell dialed in from distance and made 7 of 14 three-point attempts in the first half. They actually shot better from 3 than from 2. Junior guard Greg Dolan led the charge off the bench with 10 points in 7 minutes on 4 for 4 shooting. He's the Spider-Man of their team. He comes out of nowhere and just makes plays. Cornell went into halftime up 39-21 and put up another 39 in the second half for a 78-64 win. Statistically, Columbia shot well in the second half, 18 for 32 from the field, but they were also down 20 with 6 minutes to go. And there's a saying among coaches, everyone plays well when you're down 20. That said, even in a 20-point game, 17 rebounds aren't easy to get, and yet Patrick Harding grabbed them. 12 points and 17 rebounds on the day. Geronimo Rubio de la Rosa led Columbia with 14 points. Greg Dolan, Dean Knoll, and Sarju Patel led Cornell with 12 apiece.
Well, credit Brian Earl. He's a friend of the show, has really righted the ship there. They were on a little bit of a slide, about middle of league play, but they got things back under control just enough to get themselves into the top 4. And I'll say it here, folks. I'm sure you can find it in game notes, stats, what have you. But Brian Earl is the only coach in the history of the conference tournament that has led a team that is not Princeton, Penn, Harvard, or Yale to a top 4 finish in Ivy Madness. He has now done it twice. Well done, Big Red. And our last game to cover features the second best team in the league holding home court against the Brown Bears. Yale closes out the season with only 1 home loss in conference play as they decidedly dispatched the Brown Bears 74-65. I know that's not a big spread, but folks, they were leading the game, the Bulldogs, by as much as 17 points in the second half. Azar Swain caps a first-team All-Ivy senior season with 22.6 rebounds and 3 made threes. And the Bulldogs had a welcome return of E.J. Jarvis to the Bulldogs front court as he notched 7 points and 5 rebounds off the bench. Speaking of front courts, last week, John Solomon highlighted the brilliant season and outstanding performance that Jalen Gainey had last week. Well, his ears must have been tingling as the Brown Bears forward posted a 20-point 18 rebound performance, going 9 for 11 from the field. Folks, the kid can play, and it's a crying shame that there won't be more games to play for Gainey and his Brown Bears teammates. Credit Yale as they are looking as good as they possibly can. What an outstanding Ivy Madness tournament we are primed to have. Princeton facing off with Cornell, Penn versus Yale, Saturday and Sunday is the big championship game, and we have tracked all of these games throughout the season with my eyes don't lie to me. We've brought John Solomon, our chief in-game correspondent, in to join us on this weekly telling of the week that was. And John, I just want to say on behalf of my partner, Lawrence L. Boogie Schuler, thank you for joining us as we will certainly weigh in after Ivy Madness. Sidney Johnson, former player and head coach at Princeton, coached at Georgetown Fairfield Air Force. I'm really into youth basketball training, and I'm doing some TV games, which I'm enjoying doing that on the side. And I'm doing the Ivy League Hoops Hour podcast.
This is John Solomon. I used to cover the league at PrincetonBasketball.com, and Sydney and Lawrence have pulled me back in via this podcast.
I'm going to go in reverse order alphabetically. It's a very Ivy League thing to do. Yale.
Hi, I'm William McCormack. I'm the men's basketball beat reporter for the Yale Daily News. I am a first semester senior at Yale. This is my third season covering the team, and I'm really excited for the lead up to Ivy Madness.
Princeton.
Derek Jones, Princeton play-by-play announcer. I've been covering the team for 10 years now. I've also done some work as well with the Ivy League and ESPN.
Penn.
Vince Curran, class of 92, University of Pennsylvania, Wharton in engineering. 35 years of being in touch with Quaker basketball, and proud to be a member of this broadcast. I'm really excited about it.
Cornell.
Barry Leonard, former radio voice of Cornell for over 20 years, currently cover the team as their play-by-play announcer on ESPN Plus. So about 26 to 27 years. And like Vince just said, this is an exciting time for the Ivy League. A pleasure to share thoughts with all of you.
Here's the deal. We're going to go Yale, Princeton, Penn, Cornell to start. And what this is, obviously the top four teams have made it. And we want to hear your case for why, and don't be shy, don't be bashful, why your team can win this whole thing. We're going to start with Yale.
I'll start with defense. I think Yale has established themselves throughout the conference slate as the top defensive team in the Ivy League. They're sort of leading the league in opponent field goal percentage, defensive efficiency, opponent three-point field goal percentage. And that effort is anchored by Jalen Gabidon, Yale's captain. The team refers to him as their defensive glue. And he's in a bigger role on offense this year, too, in a way that he hasn't been earlier in his Yale career. First-year guard Bezem Bang, who entered the starting lineup during Ivy League play, has also really proven himself as an adept defender on the perimeter. And so that covers one side of the ball. On the other, I think Azar Swain will help Yale win Ivy Madness. He is the Bulldogs' best scorer, Ivy League Player of the Year candidate. And I think what sticks out to me is that he steps up in big games. He had 34 points at the Barclays Center earlier this year. As a sophomore, he had 33 against Harvard at home. And when I look back to check the stats from, the last time we had Ivy Madness, which is hard to believe, but, 3 years ago now, 2019, he only missed one three-pointer across those two games when he was playing in New Haven, hit 5 threes, and then had 12 points off the bench against LSU in the tournament. So I see Azar Swain having, he's had a lot of career games for Yale, and I don't know if he'll break his career high of 37 points, but I think he, combined with Yale's defense, will lead Yale to an Ivy Madness championship.
Derek Jones, you've got Princeton.
I think when you take a look at Princeton, the team that won the regular season Ivy League title, I think it's been about improvement for them on the defensive side, especially in the second half of the season. They have been able to impose their will, I think, in critical moments against teams. When you look at how they've played in close games, by and large, they've been pretty effective of handling tough spots, whether it be at home or on the road. They trailed in a handful of games at home to start out that first 7-game run of the Ivy League season, and they were able to bounce back mostly with the exceptions of the losses to Yale and Cornell. I think overall, from a personnel standpoint, you take a look at what they've been able to do with their key guys, and they have two, in my opinion, two strong candidates to win Ivy League Player of the Year in Tosan Iwoma and also Jalen Llewellyn. But I think first with Tosan Iwoma, he affects the game in so many ways on the offensive side, being able to not only score one-on-one, but also to be able to facilitate as well. He's having a top 10 season all-time in Princeton history in assists. He's got 124 assists so far this season, which is amazing for a post player. Then you look at outside, one of the reasons why Princeton's been so effective this year offensively, the number one offense in the Ivy League on a consistent basis, in my opinion. But when you take a look at what Iwoma is able to do in terms of impacting the offense and setting up the outside shooting, they've been so good hitting three-pointers this season. Drew Freiberg, Ryan Langborg, and of course, Jalen Llewellyn. They're shooting from the outside, and Ethan Wright too. That really makes it a challenge for defenses to slow down those particular players. You've got to kind of pick your poison and figure it out. And not many teams have been able to come up with a formula for that over the span of 40 minutes. And I think when you take a look at the Ivy League field, you feel pretty confident going into the tournament. I think if you're a Princeton supporter, when you look at how they've played, if they see Penn again, Cornell, I think is, and I'm sure we'll get into it, Cornell is a little bit of a challenge in terms of what we've seen through the first two games. And they played reasonably well outside of a half against Yale this year. So I think offensively, Princeton has been hard to stop this year. Defensively, they have been able to, I think, get better and better each game. And they're able to adjust in game as well, which I think is a significant credit to the coaching staff led by Mitch Henderson.
Penn, Vince Curran.
So if you're going to ask me about why Penn can win, because I think they have the best individual player. If you said, if you're starting a team and give me one guy, and the one guy you could argue that you would put in that same discussion would be Tosan. But right now, the way he plays, the way he gets to the basket, the way he has the ability to score in really, really fast bursts, Jordan Dingle would be the guy I would start with. So why can Penn win? Having done the game on Saturday, and I said, yeah, Dingle's got to score 30 for Penn to have a chance in this game against Princeton. He could have scored 50, and I'm still not sure they would have had a chance in that game. Princeton played magnificently well in the final at the Palestra, but why can Penn win? It's because of that guy right there. Now, what has to happen for Penn to win in addition to that? You need complementary scoring. You need Clark Slackert to play really well if he's still stuck in that starting role as opposed to coming off the bench. I think that could be problematic for him because I really like him as that sixth man coming off the bench, but you need Max Martz to play well. Does Jelani Williams get back for the tournament? Because I think the lack of Jelani Williams and George Smith on Saturday night against Princeton really hurt because they're two of their better perimeter defenders. And if you watch the game, Tosan got the ball. I said during our broadcast, he looked like Kerry Kittles. And I know Kerry Kittles was on the Princeton staff for a while. Tosan looked like he got the ball at the opposite three-point line and started going downhill and just running right at everybody. And Princeton got whatever shots they want. So why can Penn win? It's because of that. Why might Penn struggle? Their defense the last 5 games has not been great. Right now, I don't think Azar Swain's going for 37 in the 2-3 matchup. And I like Penn as a matchup against Yale versus against Princeton right now, having just watched what I watched. But Cornell-Princeton, I think Derek said it. Cornell-Princeton is a tough matchup. So if you're a Penn fan, you're looking at it and going, you hope Cornell does what they're capable of doing and plays Princeton as tough as they're able to play them. And then you take your chances against Yale and go from there. But why can Penn win? Jordan Dingle. And what does Penn need to do to play a little better and have a chance? They have to pick up the defensive intensity. And it's almost like you force Tosan, just make him go right. Put 5 guys at the middle of the court and say, go right, and then start working your way back. Because he went left hand, power dribble, attack, and Penn was on their heels the entire game. And I know I'm oversimplifying at that point, but if you get another look at Princeton, you got to think about a 1-3-1 zone. You got to think about a way to force Tosan right.
Cornell, Barry Leonard, you're on deck.
The Big Red making their first winning season since the Sweet 16 team of 2009-2010. At the start of the year, I think all the media people in the league would agree this was a mystery, having lost Jimmy Boeheim to the transfer portal and a couple of other tested seniors. There wasn't a single starter returning for Brian Earl's team, but I'm not going to say they took everybody by surprise, but their non-Ivy League season did open a few eyes around the country. For a long time, they were the top scoring team in Division I. And if you look at Cornell, they're the sum of all the parts. The strength is in the numbers. You've got 9 different players this year that have led the team in scoring in a game, 6 players that average 19 minutes or more, 11 who played 10 minutes or more a game. So there's strength in numbers. Their coach, who of course played with Mitch Henderson at Princeton, always emphasized to them, make your teammates better. The way you do that is get them the ball in a position to score. And entering this tournament, they're number 7 in the country in assists per game, just under 18. They share the basketball. If you look at their assist to turnover ratio, it's a plus 75. They've had 4 kids that have already been named the Ivy League Rookie of the Week. So I'm not going to say it's a pick your poison type of team, but coming into a game, you can't just say, all right, we're going to focus on Dean Knoll, who's having an all Ivy caliber season that's come out of nowhere. You can't say, well, they're a small team rebounding wise. All they have is Kobe Dixon. Chris Mannon, who many feel is in the Rookie of the Year talk, a kid from New Jersey who's played great against Princeton in 2 games, is probably one of the most underrated defenders in the league. I think if you go to defense, Cornell's second in field goal percentage defense in the Ivy League. They can defend as a team. They've got numbers as a team. And they just got the return of their junior guard, Greg Dolan, to the lineup for the last 2 games of the regular season. This is a tremendous pickup for Cornell because he arguably was one of their best players at the start of the season. 2 games back, he's averaged 12 points, 6 rebounds, 5 assists per game. Now, if you look at it in the big picture, I know Derek has referenced it. Vince, the matchup is going to be difficult with Princeton. The players won't say it publicly, but they know they were 1 buzzer beater away from sweeping the Ivy League regular season champs. That being said, they're not overconfident at all going into this game. In fact, I still think in many ways these guys pinch themselves to say we're here. But again, if you look at the strength in numbers, the ability to share the basketball, and on any given night, you can have a guy go off like Keller Boothby from the 3-point line, Sarju Patel, Dean Knoll penetrating with the ball along with Greg Dolan. I think they're just a very, very tough team to defend because you can lock off one player, but you got 2 or 3 others that can hurt you. Now, on the flip side, they're not very big. They're not very physical. Tosan Awoma. I don't know if anybody in the league has an answer for that kid. He would be my vote. I know we'll discuss this later on in the podcast for Player of the Year. I think it's not clear cut, but he just takes over a game. So it's going to be interesting to see how that matchup goes up. But I think Cornell's versatility can help them. Can it hurt them if a couple of key kids are locked down by Princeton's defense, perhaps? But I think it's going to be a fascinating Game 3 matchup between the 2 teams.
Off to a great start, gentlemen. Let's do this. The top 4 teams have been awesome in terms of getting here. I'm going to start with a question that came to us from Derek Jones, and I'm going to put you, Derek, on the spot. Should we expand this tournament to 8 teams? Should we keep it at 4? Derek, you get the first crack at this.
I would like to see the tournament expanded to 6 teams. I know that it does create some logistical issues that I'm sure maybe we can get to at some point, but I think you have to find a happy medium because if you allow all 8 in, then it may kind of devalue the regular season further, but I do think that it needs to be expanded. You look at every year and you could make the argument, I don't know about this year in particular, but you could make the argument that the team that got in either got some breaks along the way or maybe it wasn't the 4th best team to get in. You look at some of the races in previous years, it's come down to, maybe Columbia doesn't hold up their end of the bargain. Maybe Brown doesn't hold up their end of the bargain. And sure, they didn't meet the criteria of getting in the tournament, but I do think 6 teams, you allow the 1st and 2nd seed to have a bye. So that way you kind of pull them out of harm's way and you still keep the integrity of having some value in finishing 1st and or 2nd in the league, but you do showcase the balance of the league. I think having 6 is a reasonably good number. And then from there, maybe you play the early round or 2 before you break down into the Final 4. Maybe you do that on campus sites instead of having them at a specific site. So I am in favor of the 6. I know if Noah Savage, my broadcast partner, listens to this, he's going to go full 8 because he's a big proponent of that. But I think 6 is a little bit more of a reasonable number to help, I think, also showcase the league too and give the opportunity to other programs to make it into the tournament. I do think it's tough right now to get out of the old HYPP model of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, and kudos to Cornell because they're the only team that has kind of broken into that top 4 really over the past few years. So I would like to see more teams involved in the tournament.
If you're going to look at it and expand the whole tournament, each year for the first 3 years, there was somebody needing to get in to win a game to get in. First year was Penn needing to beat Harvard at home. And then, the year Cornell got in, so it's like there's always been some drama heading into the last weekend. And I talked to Coach Dunphy about this last weekend. And while we're both of the mindset of whatever we can do to get kids more games, part of what has happened, if you're limiting it to 4, it has made the regular season mean something. And there always has been, all right, this what has to happen in the last weekend. Now, this year's different. Now that the conference schedule has shaken out differently and you have one game in the last weekend, that kind of, in my opinion, takes some of the drama out of it anyway, because it was all known going into the last weekend. But on the flip side of that, you could say, oh man, if Brown needs to beat Yale at home last game, there's a lot of meaning in a single game Ivy weekend, even though it's a one gamer, that this team needs to win to get in. So I think from a drama perspective, from a meaningfulness of the regular season perspective, having 4 teams as a cutoff, probably a good thing. Could you say, oh, well, I would put in 6 teams, I could put in 8 teams. You lose something when you do that, right? And frankly, if it were 6 teams this year, I guarantee you none of the first 4 teams that are in now would want to face Harvard. And if you looked at Brown and said, you know what, their top 3 is as good as anybody and their top 5 is as good as anybody, probably in that same situation, right? So it's like if you had expanded it and you're trying to showcase the balance of the league, that's one thing, but you're also trying to reward teams for having won the close ones, having gotten the shots to win in certain situations. So, it's not a participation trophy. Everybody doesn't get an orange slice, right? At some point, you got to cut it off.
Well said, Vince. I'll add this, and you guys keep talking. Does any part of sending the best team from the Ivy League to the NCAA tournament weigh into this, ensuring that?
You could see Ivy Madness on the one hand as a sort of celebration of the season and the league. It's the event that gets the most national media exposure, hopefully the most fan attendance throughout the year. But it is ultimately about the March Madness auto bid, and you want your best team going to the NCAA tournament. And I think the Ivy League is also unique in its parity. There are, I think, 4 Ivy League teams bunched within about 20 spots on KenPom right now. And if you look at, Luke Benz, who does a lot of Ivy League modeling and prediction odds, has looked at the distribution of teams throughout every single one of the 32 Division I conferences. And the Ivy League is pretty much number 1 in terms of how bunched its teams are in the middle. And so I think given that parity, you run the risk, even though it would be exciting and a really fun weekend, you run the risk of a team that didn't earn necessarily the 1 seed or the 2 seed and hasn't established itself as the best team in the league, winning 2 games or 3 games during the conference tournament and getting the auto bid, even though they're not necessarily the conference's best and brightest.
But which side of the argument do you want to be on then, right? If you're saying, hey, part of what's great about the Ivy League is that you have 4 teams that are relatively bunched together and 2 or 3 more that are relatively close to that, then it's like, okay, the fact that anybody could win would lead to, hey, this could be exciting, versus Princeton was the best team with the best record this year. We want to make sure that they go. And by the way, Princeton, for me, first time I saw them live the other night, passed the eye test. They're really good. And last time I was on the podcast, I said, I don't know that there's a clear-cut, juggernaut type team. Seeing Tosan play the other night, I'm like, man, that guy can really play, right? And they have all the balance. And being from Philadelphia, we used to complain all the time that Andy Reid only wanted to pass the ball and never ran it, and there was no balance. Princeton's got balance. So if your argument is we want to send our best team to the NCAA tournament, then forget about Ivy Madness. Because it's not like right now it's going to be in a situation where you say, okay, there's going to be a huge crowd. There's going to be all this momentum around it. Now all these things are going to happen. It's going to be at Harvard on Saturday. Harvard's not playing, and there are going to be 2,500 people there. If that, they're going to be running people in and out throughout the game. So if your argument is send the best team, then scrap the whole thing. But if your argument is create some drama, create more opportunities for these kids to play, and create an environment where people are going to watch and people are going to tune in, then have 4 teams, have it at a venue where people are going to tune in. It's going to look great on TV and there's going to be excitement, or don't. Pick your poison.
I do think that that's ultimately the issue, right? You want the league to be represented well on national television, but you also want to send the best team. So it's a tough thing. That's why I would go 6 if you're going to expand it rather than 8, because I think 8 does kind of leave the door open for not maybe having the best team go. And you remember in some of the previous years where Harvard was near the top of the league, they had their hands full with Columbia. Like Columbia would take them to overtime. They've had obviously a hard time with Brian Earl and company over the last handful of years. So You're going to have matchup issues no matter what iteration of the tournament you come up with. That's why I still think it's a controversial issue that there's even a tournament in the first place. This is the first year where the host isn't there. Normally, when the host is there, that's going to make it harder on somebody. I would say to give your team the best odds, and if you want to have a situation where you're sending your best team, I think you kind of need to try to stack the deck in some way to favor the top two teams, if that makes sense.
I want to hear from Brian Earl and company. Barry Leonard, mix this in, Barry, if you will, if you'll oblige us. Should the conference tournament be moved around as we're thinking about how many teams the conference tournament should have?
When Steve Donahue was the coach here, we'd have these discussions on the bus all the time, and it was always the P's are holding it up. Then supposedly Penn was relenting, but Princeton was holding it up. And finally, the whole league went to a postseason tournament format with the top four. In listening to Vince and Derek, who've been in the league a long time, and I respect their opinions, I kind of lean a little bit over to what Derek's saying. If you put all 8 teams in, then you risk the Cinderella story again, which we've seen with other conferences around the country. But I think 6 would be the right format to give the first 2 a bye, as Derek suggested. I think that's a plausible option. But if you're asking me, should it move around to every city in the league? Again, it's all optics. Do people want to go 6, 7, 8 hours up to Hanover, New Hampshire, or Ithaca, New York? No disrespect here. It's lovely here in the spring and the summer and the fall, but in the middle of the winter, what kind of coverage are you going to get up here or in Hanover, New Hampshire? So I guess to summarize it, I would lean towards Derek's format where you'd put 6 in. But at the same time, would I move it around to all 8 schools? That one is up for debate, I think.
We had a wonderful conversation with Vince earlier in the year. Palestra is not a bad place to have a major signature event year in and year out.
I think the league will only decide between having it in one location or having it in all 8. I don't think there's a scenario where half the schools get a chance to host and the other half don't.
Fair. So what if it goes through all 8 schools, and then after that, the commissioner, the head coaches, they all kind of take a step back and say, okay, that was nice for egality's sake. We're going to the Palestra for the next 5 years.
I've heard from several different coaches as this came out, and I'm not saying head coaches, I'm not mentioning people by name, but I would be surprised if it makes it through the whole cycle.
Right.
And I think that goes a little bit to Barry's point. You get off the bus in February in Ithaca and the air freezes in your lungs and it's tough. And you got to go up to Dartmouth to play if you're going to have this tournament up there. It's not as always as bitterly cold, but it's as bitterly far, right? And if you're trying to create some momentum and some buzz around this, I don't think that's ultimately the way you go. But if you're going to put it in one spot, then at that point, you got to have all 8 teams in, right? Everybody's in at that point. Well, why not, right? It's going to be a 3-day tournament as opposed to a 2-day tournament, and you have 1 day off in the middle or something like that. You might as well just have all 8 teams and plug it in that way. And I like the idea of protecting the 1 and the 2. But if you're going to say, after cycling through all of this, let's have it in one place, then everybody's in, right? And see what happens. And frankly, should a 1 versus 8 scenario happen where an 8 beats a 1? If the league's that balanced, maybe. But how often is that going to happen? Really, it would be few and far between. And if it did happen, it would be the story of championship week. Number 1 Penn falls to number 8 whoever. Number 1 Princeton falls to number 8, or pick a team. That would actually be better for the league than protecting the number 1 seed from an exposure standpoint.
Guys, my 2 cents, if I can weigh in quick, is I hear Vince in terms of this is how you put on the best type of tournament and that rationale. And so to his point of, Princeton is looking really good, but if you're going to have a tournament, you have a tournament. And so I get it. But I also would say the best part of being an Ivy League basketball fan for me was, even if it riled me a certain way, Vince, is Jerome Allen and Matt Maloney and those guys getting through and making people understand how good they were in the Ivy League. That was a source of pride. It was tough losing to Cornell. Those guys going to the Sweet 16, that was a source of pride. They were one of the best teams I've ever seen. Harvard has won a game. Yale has won a game. Yale, Baylor, that was national news. So my 2 cents is just, if we ever get to a point, frankly, respectfully, where we're getting a couple of teams that aren't our best and they're representing us in the NCAA tournament, I think that we as a conference lose out a bit and we kind of get looked at as less than we are. And right now, the brand is pretty damn strong. And it's something that we all are prideful about. And I want to hold on to that.
But from that standpoint, Sydney, you'd say, all right, forget about the tournament, right?
Yes.
Because from my perspective, it's like, let's get the kids and the fans as many moments as they can have, right? Because it's gone before you know it. So even if you look at the Penn-Kansas game in Wichita, and Penn's a 16. Now, I didn't think they should have been a 16 that year, but they went out and they represented the league really well in Kansas against Kansas, right? Your point, Baylor, Yale beating Baylor. The first year, Princeton plays, I think it was Notre Dame.
Yep.
Right? Plays great in that game.
Harvard, New Mexico.
Exactly, right? So it's like you have all of these things. And if you're going to make the argument that there is a cluster at the top that is going to be razor thin in terms of any team being able to get there, then you say, okay, we'll take whoever has the good weekend and take our chances. Now, if you expand it to 6 and you say, okay, this year's number 6 seed somehow gets through, then you're in that position of opening yourself up to getting clobbered by somebody because somebody caught lightning in a bottle and was able to win the third matchup against this team, win the third matchup against this team, and win the third matchup against this team. So if you're going to argue that, hey, we want to make sure that we send a representative team to the NCAAs, then you don't expand it. You take the bottom half of the league out of the equation and say, I think our top 4, whoever it is, I'm going to make sure that we get one of our best to the tournament. And if it's not this year's Princeton team, which is 12-2, but it's Yale and they've got star quality and they play like their hair's on fire and Swain's got a little something to him and James always coaches them up, you say, all right, I'm willing to take my chances with that.
Got it. How about this? I want to pull Will into this. And this is related, I think. The ideal format for Ivy Madness is, why is attendance, guys, trending downward in the Ivy League? Will, can you weigh in on that a bit?
2 years ago, I wrote a story in the Yale Daily News about attendance specifically at Yale. Yale that year, this was the 2019-20 season, entering the conference slate, their KenPom rating was higher than it had been since, I think, their win over Baylor in 2016. They were hovering around the 50s. They had super close losses on the road at Oklahoma State, Penn State, UNC. And despite how good the team was, their attendance numbers just weren't great. They were actually the lowest average home attendance in the Ivy League in late January of that season. That project spawned an interest in looking at attendance numbers across the league as a whole. And over the past 20 years, they've been sliding a little bit relative to other conferences. Lawrence, I know you mentioned you had a theory, and I'm curious to hear that. One that I had was maybe just how much more difficult it is to schedule good home games. Yale, for example, hasn't been able to schedule a team in the state of Connecticut for the past 4 or 5 seasons. And a lot of the times, they're scheduling at least 1 or 2 D3 games at home.
Derek Jones.
I would say that I do think regional rivalries would help this out. It's funny, like Princeton over the last 5 years has played like BYU and Arizona State in their building, and those games drew worse numbers than a lot of the Ivy League games. So you'd think maybe, okay, Bobby Hurley, New Jersey guy coming in to Princeton to play the Tigers a year after they have a great game. The attendance, I thought, was a little disappointing. So I think that having the local teams play each other would help. But, a lot of these coaches you talk to sometimes will say, hey, fill in the blank team will not play us, or these teams won't play us because they saw us beat a Power 5 school. So I do think that's a part of the issue. I think student engagement is sometimes an issue as well, trying to get the students hyped up for games during the course of the year as well.
I agree with Derek in that getting teams to be willing to come in and play you is a real problem. Penn always had an advantage in January when Princeton was in exams and wasn't going to play. Penn always had 3 Big 5 games or 2 Big 5 games. They were going to get St. Joe's on one Saturday. They were going to get Temple on another Saturday. It was a built-in advantage. Now, conferences are getting bigger, and you have a hard time scheduling, especially the January games. And we talked about this the last time we were on. You get bunched up early in the season, then you got a big gap, and then you have the Ivy League season now gets spread out with a bunch of 1-game weekends and a couple of 2-game weekends. So it's hard to get any kind of flow. And then on top of that, you have a changing dynamic in terms of what students are going to watch. So like everybody's pulled in 27 different directions. Now, I will say this, even though the attendance may be trending down, there were 5,000 people at the Palestra on Saturday night, and the students were on spring break. So that's, that says something. And then there were 4,000 people there 2 weeks before at home against Harvard. It's not 7,000 or 8,000 there for Princeton or 9,000 like it used to be, but people showed up and people will watch a good product. And I think, the fact that you're missing some of the regional games and some of the regional rivalries, yeah, that's part of it. But if you put a good product out there, I'm still convinced that people will start to show up.
Is there anything that the schools can do or the league can do to promote rivalries in the Ivy League and the overall competitiveness, non-conference scheduling? Are there any thoughts you guys have that can improve attendance and also shine a brighter light on the league? And let me cue you up a bit, and I'll just get this off my chest. I think the Princeton-Penn rivalry is one of the greatest basketball rivalries in the game, but it doesn't feel that way as much. I think the scheduling, Vince, I might be on an island here, but those Tuesdays were magical.
They were great.
And going away from that, just my humble opinion, I'm old, guys, so just bear with me. I think it hurt a really good rivalry. It hurt a uniqueness. It hurt something that made that matchup special. And anything that undermines your rivalries, whereas I look at, and this is an extreme example, but the ACC sells its soul to push the Duke-UNC rivalry because it helps everybody else in the league. Kids want to go to Virginia to try to beat Duke, who has a showcase game against Carolina.
To your point, though, Sydney, right? You have the game being played on Saturday versus a Tuesday. Now, there was always the last Tuesday of the year for the years where Penn and Princeton were the dominant players. There was a really good chance that that game was going to come down to a league title, right? But then you go on the other side of it, not as much this year, because I think it was Penn Brown the first game this year from a Penn perspective, but like playing Penn Princeton January 1st or January 3rd or December 29th, it makes no sense. Right. And if you're going to have the built-in rivalries, and like I guess you could argue that the other schools would say, oh, well, wait a minute. If you're going to have Harvard and Yale on this and Penn and Princeton on this, then the other 4 schools are going to be at a disadvantage. Yeah, probably it is a disadvantage. But those are the marquee matchups right now. You have one that is an historic marquee matchup, and then you have another one, which is the marquee matchup just institutionally. Right. So those are the ones you need to highlight, and it's a similar argument to have it at the Palestra, right? Have the tournament at the Palestra. If you're going to be real about this and you're going to try and make this Ivy League basketball thing that we all love as big as it could possibly be, you're going to have to make some of those concessions. You're going to have to make sure that the Penn-Princeton rivalry gets highlighted. You're going to have to make sure that Harvard-Yale get highlighted. And then as Cornell has teams or as Brown has teams, do you adjust year to year? Yeah, maybe you adjust year to year, but it should start off right there. Do what you do well, highlight what you do well, or just say what it is. Everybody gets an orange slice. It's about the competition, and we just want to be fair and equitable, and everybody has a good time. And if that's where you are, then that's a different discussion. But it's not where I want to be, and I don't think anybody on this podcast wants to be there. We want to win a first-round game. We want to be talking about, can Cornell beat Kentucky at the Carrier Dome? Cornell had a Final Four level team that year, except they run into Kentucky, which was 3 first-round draft picks?
Yeah, they had.
We want to have those conversations.
Six and 2 rounds.
How good is that Baylor team, or that Yale team that beats Baylor, and how far can they go? And this year's team, again, Tosan is going to be a monster matchup for anybody that he plays against. If Princeton goes and wins it. It's impossible to guard. So like that's what we should be talking about, not, oh, let's be average. Oh, it's this isn't fair because they're not getting as much TV time as the Penn, Princeton, Harvard, Yale matchup. All right, well, do something about it.
Amen to that, Vince. I happen to agree with every word. But Bear, I'm going to put you on the spot. Like, not only the Cornell teams, Vince just beat me to it, they were awesome. And maybe I buried my head in the sand as the league and other people trumped them up. I think enough people knew about them. But, Brian, and okay, he's a friend of mine. They're the only team that's made it in the Ivy Madness. And is that being pushed enough by Cornell, by the Ivy League, like just in general, the success stories that we have had, and this is in part an inspiration for the pod, is to push these stories out and let people know. So, just from your vantage point, how would you weigh in?
Well, first off, to back up 1 second on what Vince has consistently said throughout this podcast, when you look at college basketball, I'm watching the ACC series, the history of the ACC tournament. They're always hyping up the Greensboro Coliseum. I'm thinking about what Vince was just saying. You look at the Palestra, and again, not because I'm an Ivy League broadcaster and fan, that is a mecca for Eastern college basketball. I mean, you just walk around the facility prior to the game and see the glass cases that show all the great players and teams and decades of just dominance. And that's something that the league needs to push. So I would agree relative to if you're going to let it go around the league one time, then have the Ivy League tournament for a 3 to 5 year contract period at the Palestra. But to answer your question about Coach Earl and Cornell and the Ivy League, I think with the proliferation of cable and everything, just this ESPN Plus deal, I think had the attention of the league 3 or 4 years ago. Now that they've gotten it, I think they don't so much coast with it, but they just let it play out itself. I agree, there's not enough Penn, Princeton hype over the game. What Brian's doing in Ithaca, is it similar to what Steve's doing? Well, Steve had a very patient athletic director that gave him 7 years before they won 3 consecutive Ivy League titles. Brian's doing this now in year 6. Now, by no means can you make a comparison between a Sweet 16 team and a Brian Earl 60-year team, but should it get a little bit more publicity? Perhaps. At the university level, as you guys know, hockey is the big winter sport here. Although that 3 year period, which they call Camelot for Ivy League athletics at Cornell, the 3 years of 3 consecutive Ivy League titles in the Sweet 16, attendance there was packed. There were 3,500 fans, guys painting their faces, students with fraternity brothers with no shirts on, kind of a raucous, rowdy crowd. People around here that are pure basketball fans in Ithaca, they still talk about those days, but it's kind of in a muted, quiet way. So I think the university, do they share part of the publicity campaign needed for this, as well as the Ivy League front office? I would think so, but I think this ESPN Plus contract has given them so much additional publicity that they not so much coast on it, but they rely on it more than generating their own storylines, like the Penn Princeton rivalry, like what Brian Earl's doing at Cornell, what James Jones has done at Yale all those years. I mean, we don't put enough emphasis on our coaches. I mean, I would put Steve Donahue, James Jones, Brian Earl, Mitch Henderson up against any coach in the country for X's and O's.
Amen.
It's really well said, Barry. And again, I mean, we started to focus a little bit more down the stretch with student athletes, but we wanted it coaches and student athletes because of these stories that are not being told. They're just amazing things going on with how good the coaches are, and then with the student athletes, their backgrounds and what they're into off the court and what they're accomplishing on the court. And that's maybe a great segue. We said we were going to talk about Player of the Year. By the time people listen to this pod, those awards will be out. But just right here with you guys, Player of the Year is, we'll start with Will.
Player of the Year is, as much as I would want it to be Azar Swain, and I think he's right up there, I think Tosan Awoma probably has the Ivy League Player of the Year award secured. He has, like people have alluded to, been a dominant presence on the inside. His assist numbers, he leads the league in assists, I think 5 a game, maybe far more than anyone else. I think, the next number is 3.3 a game. And he's really established himself as just as a key presence for Princeton. You could also, who else is in the conversation? Azar Swain, Jordan Dingle has been a tremendous scorer. Jalen Gainey, I think people talk about his defense a lot, his shot blocking ability. I almost think he could be in the conversation, even though he might, have Ivy League Defensive Player of the Year locked up. But I think Tosan Uoma is the likely choice.
Derek Jones, what say you?
I would have to go with Tosan as well. I think that when you look at what he's done this season, the other thing I think you have to take a look at as well is what else is going on around him. And yes, as it was brought up earlier, he's a tough guard. And that is, to me, one of the things that makes him such a dynamic player. We've seen teams come up with different approaches on how to slow him down, and no one's been able to do it in a consistent way. But I think his ability to make his teammates better around him has really helped out tremendously. When you look at Princeton's three-point shooting, I'm not saying it's all Tosan who is setting this up, but when you look at a player who has 124 assists on the season, that's incredible for a guy who is playing really a great deal all over the place. He controls it at the top. Sometimes he's in the paint. I mean, he's all over the place on the floor. But you look at the number of players on Princeton this season that have at least 63 pointers made this season. Ryan Langborg, Ethan Wright, and Drew Freiberg. Drew Freiberg is up to 73 pointers now on the season, and that's a top 10 all-time performance by a Princeton player. A lot of that is happening because of Tosan's ability to free up things on the offensive side for his teammates. One of Princeton's worst performances of the year was against Monmouth, and they lost to Monmouth on the road, I believe, heading into Thanksgiving, day before Thanksgiving. He did not play in that game, and it looks a lot different when he's not in the mix for the Tigers. So I think that his ability to be able to not only produce at a level, and he's flirted with a triple-double on a couple of occasions this year, he's great individually, but he makes his teammates better. And I think mixing all of that together is why he's the Ivy League Player of the Year.
Vince.
I would be shocked if it weren't Uoma, and especially having watched him the other night against Penn, he just passes the eye test. But I would also say this. If you look back at the history of this Player of the Year award, there have been years where you go, you know what? That guy had a better year. I thought it should have been, somebody else. Like the Wes Saunders, I thought, as only a one-time Ivy League Player of the Year, surprised me. A.J. Broder, the year that Penn wins the Ivy League, is number one seed and wins the tournament. Not the Ivy League Player of the Year that year. He comes back a couple years later and ties with Paul Atkinson. So I think Uoma is, based on the results and based on the eye test and based on his production, is probably going to be the winner this year, and I would not have a whole lot of argument against it. It wouldn't surprise me if you come back next year and it's not Uoma and it's somebody else that you're not thinking of right now. Like Jordan Dingle having 5 30-point games in the Ivy League, first time since Ernie Beck. That's a long time ago. Dingle is a special player, and I think there are a lot of special players in the league, right? And Uoma kind of comes onto the scene and has just this monster year and does everything that he needs to do. So again, I would be surprised if it weren't him, and I wouldn't be surprised. He could have a better year next year and not be the Ivy League Player of the Year just because of how his team does, or more importantly, how another team does. You're the guy that makes everything go on a 12-2 regular season champion. Yeah. And again, Princeton's got great balance. They've got Llewellyn, I think, is terrific, and Freiberg, and like all of these pieces that Mitch has, and he's really done a good job of orchestrating that. Well, now a couple of those are gone next year, and does Uoma grab a new cast of characters and elevate them, right? He could have a better year, and the record could be worse, and maybe he's not the Ivy League Player of the Year next year. He's going to go into it as the preseason favorite for it, but that's why you play the games, and that's how it plays out. And having seen it enough over the years where you see, like Matt Maloney wins the Ivy League Player of the Year after Jerome Allen had won it twice. It's just how the year plays out. But that's my long-winded way of saying Uoma, I think, is going to be the winner this year, and deservedly so, and not taking anything away from what he may or may not do next year. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody else next year came back and had a similar type year and elevated their team and won the award. Now, also wouldn't surprise me if he does it again, because I think he's fantastic. And I think it's a pretty clear Ivy League first team this year between Dingle, Awoma, Swain. I think you put Kirkwood in the conversation, and probably Llewellyn from Princeton would be my 5. But once you get to that 4 or 5 range, you could swing one guy in or out by a slot. But I think that's the way it goes.
Barry Leonard, Player of the Year for the Ivy League is?
Well, I think, as my fellow commentators have so eloquently put it, it looks like a 3-horse race on paper with Awama, Dingle, and Swain. But I just remember game 2, Cornell, Princeton, in Ithaca, as I was doing the game with Eric Taylor, who was a pretty good big man back in the league, back in the day, honorable mention All Ivy, a 3-time captain. During a commercial break, he just took the headset off and he said, Awoma, I had no idea he was this dominant. And I think, no disrespect to the other 4 starters on the Princeton 5, because as Vince and Derek have put, they're very, very good complementary pieces. But you take Awoma out of that lineup and they're still very good, but he makes them great. He elevates everybody around him. His ability to lift off the floor, pass, make his teammates better, high percentage rebounder, 5 assists per game. I think he's my pick for the most valuable player this year.
My 2 cents, if you'll allow me. I've covered Mountain West games, which is a really good level, Atlantic 10 games, really good level. Not only is he the Player of the Year, but Tosan's a pro, guys. I think when you look at college basketball and guys who can't be guarded one-on-one, and they demand, as Derek was talking about, these different schemes, those guys are likely way better than the level they're playing and will be paid to play basketball. And the uniqueness of his game and the way the modern game is trending. And Miye Oni is obviously charted a path, as well as other, Jeremy Lin's and those. Don't be surprised if Tosan finds himself on a G League team for a couple developmental years and he's playing 82 games a year. That's my humble opinion.
As a Penn fan, I hope he declares now, Sidney. Let him to go.
I don't think he's leaving that degree on the table just yet. We had a student athlete on earlier in the show, Tamaning Cho, earlier in the season. One of the things he talked about is possibly having scholarships in the league. Don't attach it to Cho, attach it to me and our forum here at our roundtable. How would you guys respond to that? Is that something that has ever crossed your mind?
How far off are we already, right? With the financial aid packages and the level of earnings your parents need to show. I love the concept of, hey, you have a scholarship to come to Penn, or you have a scholarship to go to Princeton or to Harvard or anything like that. The question I always ask is, what's the difference? If you're getting a financial aid package and you're not paying anything anyway, then it's a different sales pitch, right? It's like, hey, we're offering you, right? You have a scholarship. And so I think ideally, I would love to be able to have our institutions offer scholarships. I would love to have our collective institutions place a higher priority on men's and women's basketball, for sure. But there's one level of, are we going to offer scholarships? And then there's another level of, we are going to make this the signature athletic piece of the Ivy League experience, right? So I think it's less important about what you're calling a scholarship versus a financial aid package, and more important to making a collective institutional priority out of men's and women's basketball, because it's a place where you could do it, right? I could see the argument against, hey, we don't want to compete in football with 100 scholarships and all that. Men's and women's basketball, you could do it, and you get a lot of exposure about it, and you could put yourself in a position to have a product out there that raises the profile of the league. Now, some people would say, I don't want to raise the profile of the league. Well, if that's your answer, then I can't argue that. But if you're going to say, hey, we're going to offer scholarships, well, then if you're going to offer scholarships, commit to doing it right. Commit to raising the exposure of the league, and commit to putting a gigantically monumental, awesome product on the floor.
And what would that look like, Vince? I'm curious, and I like where you're going. Can you detail that in terms of that awesome product, whether it's in lieu of scholarships or in addition to scholarships? What more can be done on behalf of men's and women's basketball in the Ancient Eight?
The Ivy League could be a 2 or 3 bid league if you were, 1, scholarships, 2, in terms of admission standards and who you're able to get in. I know the Penn Final Four team seems like, a long time ago. It's not that long ago. Mike Krzyzewski was beginning his career at Duke. So we're one or two generations removed from being able to do that. And you have the physical plant, you have the money, you have the ability to go out and influence policy. You have inroads at ESPN, you have inroads at CBS Sports, you have Comcast, the NBC Universal, you have two Penn people at the top of that. So there is an ability to commit to it and to work the areas where you can expand the league. But with one, okay, we're going to have scholarships, and then we're going to make sure that we can get student athletes into the institutions that not, and like you can't let in guys with welding degrees and stuff like that. I'm not saying that, but you have people that you can get in and you can help and you can make sure that they are able to do the work. There was a kid on campus the other day. He's passing through, and I said, "This place changed my life." The kid looked at me like I was, "You're just an old man." This place changed my life, and that's the opportunity that we need to put out there. So if we're going to give scholarships, everybody's giving scholarships. Make sure we're getting kids into the institutions whose lives we can change and who can play basketball at a high level and who can elevate and bring something to their universities and get better TV packages and get more national exposure and win games in the tournament and get two teams in. Right? The women, Penn and Princeton women, were in the tournament, 2 or 3 years ago, where Princeton got the at-large bid. This should not be an anomaly. We should have 2 or 3 teams in the tournament on an annual basis. That should be the goal.
Vince, I agree with you on what you're saying, but as someone like yourself who's been around this league for 20 to 25 years, and I can't speak for presidents and administrators at the other 7 schools, there always seem to be 3 statements that would never change. One, the Ivy League football champion would play in a postseason football bowl tournament, which is the biggest double standard in athletics in the league, I think. You're only playing 10 games a week, and you're saying you can't play in a postseason because you'll miss travel time. Your travel time will have you miss class and the like. To me, that's a hill of beans. Number 2, the Ivy League basketball will never go to a tournament. Well, that's happened. The third one was the scholarship. And I think that you'll get pushback from other coaches and other sports on each of the campuses. And I honestly think that a lot of the Ivy League presidents, while they understand sports, a lot of them look at it as recreational and intramurals based on how many sports an individual school has to support. So I think it's great if we did that, focus on basketball, but I just don't see it singling out for one sport in the near future.
I don't disagree with you on that, Barry. But the question was, if we're going to go to scholarships, how would you do it? And it's okay, let's pick men's and women's basketball. But my leading into a point was you have all of these other sports that are there. And what's the step from going to a financial aid package to a full scholarship, right? What's the step of, we're spreading out this many scholarships over this many lacrosse players at Maryland or Duke or whatever, or however they do that in all these other places. So I agree with you. I don't think it's going to happen. But if the question is, if we're going to go to scholarships, how would you do it? Yeah, jump in with both feet, commit to it, and raise the profile and do it that way. Do I think that that's the reality of the situation? No, I probably don't. But if we're going to do it right, or don't do it. Forget it. Same argument I made with the Ivy tournament. Do it right or don't do it.
But you got to get 8 schools in agreement. That's a political quagmire for a lot of schools, I would think.
Well, and not to be cute about it, but is the consensus to not have them, and that's why we're where we are. You know what I mean? It's like you're going to have to engender a consensus to offer scholarships, and right now it seems like the Ancient Eight institutions generally are fine the way it is.
If you ask Dave McLaughlin right now, hey, you know what, so and so's at Vermont, but I'd give him a scholarship to Dartmouth. You don't think he'd be like, yeah, I'd like to give that kid a scholarship? Right? I'd love to be able to steal somebody from a top program in one of these rival leagues. You look back at the Patriot League when they got out and started giving scholarships, and Muscala's at Bucknell and CJ McCollum's at Lehigh, and they're 2 scholarship players, and that league was ahead of, they were a grant and aid league, and now they went to a scholarship league. They get 2 NBA guys. And it was a fantastic Patriot League championship game on CBS. I know it because they did it. It was awesome. At Bucknell, there were 4,500 people there. It was great. And we could have that if the decision were to go to scholarships. Do you pick up another pro? Do you pick up another, Tosan? Okay, let's argue he's a pro. Do you pick up Mia Oni? He's a pro. It had been a really long time between pros, from Jerome Allen to Mia Oni, guys in the NBA. So do you think you could attract guys that are NBA level talents that may otherwise go elsewhere if you said to them, I'm going to give you a scholarship to go to Harvard? Yeah, you could.
It's been an absolute highlight. I'm just thrilled. In terms of predictions, just tell me what you see. The two semis and the final. What do you got, Will?
Sure. I think I have Princeton beating Cornell in the semifinal, Yale beating Penn, and then Yale edging out Princeton in their third meeting in the championship game. I think the biggest thing is that I'm just excited. It's been so long since we had, an Ivy Madness tournament. Hard to believe that, 3 years is a long time. And it was this week, 2 years ago, that sort of the world and the country shut down with COVID. So I think regardless of the outcome, I'm just excited to see people play and see the league pull off a successful weekend.
Derek, what do you got?
First of all, before I get to the individual predictions, I think that one of the interesting dynamics I'm really looking forward to, and I believe Vince mentioned this earlier, I don't want to say it's going to be weird, but not having the host play in this is going to be a little weird.
It is. Yeah. Talk about that. Like, why is that weird?
Because I think it does speak to having the tournament feel a certain way. I think it energizes the building and makes it, when you turn on the television and watch Penn take on Princeton 5 years ago in the Ivy League tournament, that had a big time feel to it. Not to say that the other games that will take place this weekend won't, but the fact that you kind of have that buzz missing and that extra juice from the fans in the area, I hope that doesn't hurt the overall vibe of the tournament for the weekend. So I think that's one of the interesting things I'm kind of looking for heading in, because I think that's going to be an odd part of it. It's one thing for Harvard, because I think a lot of people expected Harvard to be there in the first place. But the fact that it's in their building and they're not there, that's going to make for an interesting feeling there, I think, this weekend once you get into these games. Now, having said that, I think one of the other big surprises of the weekend is going to be if any of these games are blowouts. I think all of these games could very well be decided in the last 2 minutes or last minute or so. I think when you look at Princeton, Cornell, and some of the iterations that could come out to play, I think it's going to be a tough tournament as a whole. I like Princeton to get by Cornell. I think it is a dangerous matchup. I think it's hard to ignore that. It's a very dangerous matchup for the Tigers when you take a look at it, as was brought up earlier. You're a buzzer beater away from Cornell having won the regular season series. And then I think from that point on, I look for Yale to knock off Penn. Princeton, Yale, I like Princeton to win the Ivy League tournament.
Vince, where do you weigh in?
I look at the two matchups, and I agree with Derek that I think the one that intrigues me a little bit more is the Cornell-Princeton one, because from a Penn perspective, you hope that Brian has the secret sauce to figure out, how to solve what Princeton is trying to do. Ultimately, if you ask me to pick the game, I would pick Princeton to win it. But I also think that Brian traditionally has played Mitch's teams very well. And from a Penn perspective, since if you're able to get past Yale, you would be happier to probably to face Cornell than you would to face Princeton. I don't think you're looking forward to anybody at this point. I think it's Princeton, but I will be intrigued to see how Brian game plans for it. And as I've said about him before, Brian is a wonderful guy when you meet him. And he's a guy that I've introduced to my parents, and he's like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Curran, how you doing? And then I watch him during the game, and he's a friggin' madman. And I love that about him. And I love his intensity. So I expect Cornell to come out ready to go. The Penn-Yale game, frankly, for me, Swain's Swain. He's great, and he's got the attitude. You watch 23 years of James being there. He's always got some guy with a little bit of attitude and a little bit of swag to him, and he's who he is. From a Penn perspective, it comes down to Gabadon. He's killed Penn in the two matchups this year. And he's traditionally played pretty well against him. He has 32 up there at Yale a couple weeks back. So that's going to be something that I think is going to be important. Now, of course, being a Penn alum, having a couple Penn diplomas on my wall, I'm picking Penn to beat Yale, and then I'm picking Penn to beat Princeton. And you heard it here first. There you go.
All right, Vince. We'll circle back for
Oh,
sure.
I know. I'm going to put myself out there, though, Sid.
Barry Leonard, what's this weekend going to look like?
I'm torn like Vince. I'm not a Cornell graduate, but I've been here 27 years doing Cornell basketball. And I look at this matchup on paper. There's so many enticing parts of it, starting with the two coaches. Brian said to me in the past, Matt Langle and Mitch Henderson, when he coaches against each of them, it's like coaching against your brother. But to Vince's point, once the ball comes up, then comes out the eye of the tiger. Keep in mind that in the two games between the clubs, Cornell had the lead 83% of the time. This comes from Jeremy Hardigan, the all Ivy guy at Cornell.
Wow.
And in game one, they had the lead for the first 39 minutes before a buzzer beater. But that all aside, I just don't know if they have an answer for Owama. Conversely, has Princeton figured out, how you could stop Cornell's three-point shooting in depth? Because now that they have Dolan, they can run still another player in at you. But I think Princeton's core four will have just enough to get by. I think it's like Ali Frazier 3, these two, for many different reasons. So I think Princeton will just get by Cornell. And I'm a bit biased with Penn because of my supreme admiration for Coach Donahue over the years. I mean, you got two great individual players within that game, Swain and Dingle. But I think, no disrespect to James Jones, who's a phenomenal coach. If it comes down to coaching, I think Penn's going to have a slight edge. So I look for Penn to beat Yale. And then the Princeton P final game, I'll give the edge barely to Princeton.
All right. As Vince said, folks, you heard it here first. And I can speak on behalf of Lawrence and John. This was like, we were looking forward to this so very much. And you guys have come through big time. This has been a home run experience for all of us. And you guys helped me achieve the goal, simply to have a rich and joyful conversation about something that I know we all love and we've come together. I hope this isn't a one-off and that you'll come back. All right, Lawrence, let's react to the Ivy League Men's Basketball Awards that were just announced. Player of the Year goes to Tosan Owoma, the consensus pick from our roundtable discussion. And boy, did we get that right. A bright, bright future that he's only just begun. A junior who's playing outstanding basketball for the Tigers and hopes to lead them to a championship. Defensive Player of the Year, none other than Jalen Gainey. No surprise there. Shot blocking master, monster rebounder, has also flourished on the offensive end. Well-deserved for Gainey and the senior for the Brown Bears. No surprise for Rookie of the Year, Keno Lilly Jr. He reminds me so much of Doug Davis, his shiftiness, his ability to make shots, cool and calm under pressure. Well done for Keno Lilly Jr. out of the DMV area. And one of our favorites, without question, and we won't shy away from it. Coach of the Year is none other than Brian Earl for the Cornell Big Red. Well done, B. Earl. I know that you have a ton of family and friends that are proud of you and what you've built there at Cornell, and the league coaches acknowledge the job that you've done. Looking at the first team All-Ivies, Noah Kirkwood, who was on the show, unanimous selection for first team. Jordan Dingle as well, another former guest of the show. Tosan Owoma, a former guest of the show, and Azar Swain, a former guest of the show. And it looks like we have to do our dangness to get Jalen Llewellyn, who is a first-team All-Ivy selection as well. So 2 Tigers represented, Swain, Dingle, and Kirkwood. On the second team, Lawrence, Tamaning Cho from Brown, Jalen Gabadon from Yale, Ethan Wright, outstanding guard for the Princeton Tigers, comes in for a second-team All-Ivy acknowledgement. Well-deserved to Brendan Berry from Dartmouth. Fantastic shooter for the Big Green. They won 4 out of their last 5 games. Strong finish for them. Jalen Gainey, another well-deserved honor for him. He really was one of the top players in the league. And Dean Knoll represents the Cornell Big Red, the lone player for the Big Red program. Dean Knoll. Honorable mention, Aaron Rye for Dartmouth. And that rounds out your Ivy League Men's Basketball Awards for this season. Hot off the presses for 2022. As we get closer to Ivy Madness, we know who the coaches have acknowledged. You've heard who the Roundtable has acknowledged. And we congratulate all players and the one coach in Brian Earl, but also all the coaches in terms of their recognized student athletes. Lawrence, before we close out the show, let's acknowledge our non-Ivy League nod of the week, and that's going to go to Ed Cooley, the head coach for the Providence Friars. Ed is a friend of mine, and more than that, he's an outstanding basketball coach. He led the Friars to their first Big East regular season championship in school history. How about that? And he is on many people's list for National Coach of the Year. Congratulations, Ed Cooley. We're also going to send a congratulations to the Columbia women's basketball team. And that is our Spreading the Love feature of the week. As the Columbia women coming in at 21-5, they match a program record for wins, 21 wins. And they have qualified for their first postseason appearance as an NCAA Division I program by locking up the second seed in the Ivy Madness tournament for women's basketball. Well done, Columbia Lions. Well done, Ed Cooley. Well, that wraps it up for our show this week. I am honored, as always, to be bringing this show with my co-host, Lawrence L. Boogie Schuler, dear friend of mine, and we have truly enjoyed this experience working together side by side, checking out the teams, looking at film, poring over the analytics, and now we're finally here to see who will best represent the league going on to the NCAA tournament as Ivy Madness starts. We've also been able to pull in John Solomon, who's been an outstanding chief in-game correspondent for us to weigh in on the Tigers and other things with men's basketball. And along the way, we've had you all. We're not done yet, folks. Email us at ivyleaguehoopshour@gmail.com. Let us know how we're doing. Continue to spread the word. We still want those 5-star ratings and those follows. All that you can do in terms of supporting the show, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, however you consume your podcast content, and spread the word in terms of what we're trying to do. And frankly, shine the light on men's basketball in the Ivy League with you, enlightening us in terms of stuff that we need to look at, highlight, and enjoying the conversation as much as we do on our end. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Is there a need for handshake lines still? What are your thoughts on handshake lines?
Well, I mean, yes, categorically, without question. And that would be an embarrassment to the sport to do away with handshake lines. You've got to be able to compete with somebody fiercely. And then when the buzzer goes off, you have to be able to respect your opponent and show that. I just think what are we doing if we can't shake hands and distinguish ourselves from the standpoint of like, this is organized and for the game that's greater than any one of us, that, yeah, we're going to battle it out. We're going to go at each other. There might be some gamesmanship within the game, but then when that buzzer goes off, hey, I see you, I respect you, whether I won or lost. That has to happen.